Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Forever Part 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. This story focuses on a man named Henry who has lived for over 200 years. In his quest to uncover the secret of his immortality, he chose to become a medical examiner because it's the profession closest to death. Over the years, although he hasn't discovered the secret to his eternal life, he has solved numerous mysterious cases. With more than 2 centuries of life experience, Dr. Henry has a unique perspective on almost everything. One day, while riding the subway, Henry noticed a beautiful woman. He greeted her in Russian, which surprised her. How did he know she was Russian? Henry replied, "She's eating Russian chocolate." He also deduced that the woman had a performance that evening by noticing the indentations on her fingers and the watermarks on her neck. His keen observations won her over. As they parted ways without a smelly kiss, she invited Henry to her performance and suggested they grab a drink afterward, and perhaps he could give her some hormone therapy for free. Henry, of course, didn't refuse, ready to kick off his hormone journey. But just then another subway train crashed into theirs, and a steel bar pierced Henry's chest. The woman was killed instantly. Henry was in immense pain, not from his own injury, but from helplessly watching someone he liked die right in front of him. This reminded him of something that happened over 200 years ago. Back then, he was a doctor on a ship struck by an outbreak of disease. The captain wanted to throw the infected overboard, but Henry objected. The captain shot him and threw him into the ocean. After that, something changed in Henry. Every time he died, he would come back to life in the water. Sure enough, Henry died again due to the incident, but as expected, he revived in the water. And as always, he was completely naked when he reappeared, leading people to think he was insane but not sexy. He had gotten used to it by now, though. Over the years, Henry had been arrested countless times for public nudity. Soon, Abe, Henry's adoptive son and the only person who knew Henry's secret, came to pick him up. Meanwhile, Detective Jo stumbled out of a building and got into her car, only to be chased by her one-night stand from the night before. It turned out she had accidentally taken the wrong phone. Jo, however, wanted nothing more to do with the shitty man. For her, it was just a fling. Jo arrived at the scene of the subway crash. There were no survivors, but technically there was one. On the ground, she found an antique watch which belonged to Henry. Clearly, his body had already disappeared. The initial forensic report suggested that the train conductor had a heart attack, causing the crash that claimed 14 lives, but further investigation was needed. Henry and Abe returned to their antique shop. After living for 200 years, Henry had become an expert in the field. He began documenting his experiences with death, even analyzing the levels of pain he felt each time. He didn't see immortality as a blessing. In fact, he considered it a curse. Desperate to find the cause of his condition and rid himself of the curse, he continued working at the New York City Medical Examiner's office, where fresh bodies arrived daily. Today, his task was to perform an autopsy on the subway conductor. Detective Jo arrived at the autopsy room to determine the cause of the train conductor's death. Henry immediately put his skills to use. By observing the marks on Jo's ring finger and the necklace she wore with a ring on it, he deduced that her significant other had passed away less than a year ago. This left Jo stunned. She hadn't expected such a keen observation just 5 seconds after meeting him. Henry then informed Jo that the conductor hadn't died from a heart attack. He explained that the presence of numerous air bubbles in the conductor's lungs indicated that he had been poisoned. Jo was shocked by this revelation. If this was a case of murder, it meant 14 lives had been taken deliberately, a far more serious situation. Henry clarified that this was just a hypothesis, and further independent analysis would take about 3 weeks to confirm. However, Henry's assistant, Lucas, was confident that Henry's assessment was correct, noting that Henry rarely needed an autopsy to pinpoint the cause of death. He suggested that Jo should start investigating the case immediately. Just as Jo was processing this, Henry received a phone call. The mysterious caller on the phone seemed to know Henry well, even asking how he survived the subway crash. This left Henry stunned. Someone else knew his secret, but he had no idea what their true intentions were. Back at the antique shop, Henry told Abe about the mysterious person. Feeling the danger, Henry planned to pack up and leave, as someone had discovered his secret many years ago, which led to him being captured and experimented on, drained of blood. However, Abe, now older and tired, had grown comfortable in this place and didn't want to move again. He urged Henry to stay and uncover the identity and motives of this mysterious person. Meanwhile, Jo had spotted a suspicious figure in the security footage. To her surprise, the owner of the pocket watch turned out to be none other than Henry, who had been on the ill-fated subway. This discovery left her puzzled. Later, Henry arrived at his office and received a mysterious letter. When he opened it, he found a photo of himself with a woman. It was clear the mysterious person had sent it. Suddenly, Henry started to believe that the subway crash had been orchestrated by the mysterious person to prove that he couldn't die, a carefully planned trap. Determined, Henry retrieved the conductor's body and extracted the poison from it. He figured that if he could identify the poison and determine when it was administered, he could track down the mysterious person. While toxicological analysis would take 3 weeks, Henry had another idea. He would inject the poison into himself. Though he wasn't sure he would survive this time, he felt it was worth the risk. Soon, the poison took effect, and Henry's body began to convulse. The poison worked quickly, and as usual, Henry revived in the river, where Abe picked him up by car. Through his experience with death, Henry identified the poison aconite, which was notorious for its swift, lethal effect. Victims would die before they even felt any pain. When they returned to the antique shop, they were shocked to find the police had already surrounded the place. Joe stepped out of the shop, clearly there for Henry. He was taken to the station for questioning, as his watch had been found at the scene, and security footage had captured him boarding the subway. Joe demanded an explanation, but Henry pointed out the flaws in this logic. If he were the killer, he could have simply declared the conductor's death as a heart attack, and he certainly wouldn't have used aconite, a poison known for its rapid effects, while many others take weeks to manifest, allowing for undetected kills. At this point, Henry realized a crucial detail. The fast-acting nature of aconite meant the killer had to have been on the train at the time of the crash. Without enough evidence, Detective Joe had no choice but to release Henry. Back at the lab, Henry examined the conductor's body again and found a needle mark behind his ear, along with a fingerprint on his neck. Meanwhile, Joe had begun her own investigation into Henry. His first recorded job was as a gravedigger, adding to the mystery surrounding him. As she discussed Henry's odd behavior with her superior, Henry suddenly appeared behind her, catching her off guard. Embarrassed, Joe tried to explain herself, but Henry didn't mind and said he had heard worse. He handed her a file containing the fingerprint he had lifted from the conductor's neck. They had traced it to its owner, a person without any prior criminal record. Henry and Joe found the suspect's house, and Henry rushed to the backyard. There, they discovered dead rats, clearly victims of some kind of poison. Next, they entered a greenhouse and were shocked to see it filled with aconite plants, the very poison used in the case. When they opened the storage shed, they caught the suspect in the middle of preparing more poison. At that moment, the suspect returned home, forcing them to quickly hide. Joe pulled out her gun, intending to apprehend the suspect, but he grabbed a jar of poison from the table and hurled it at her. The glass shattered in Joe's hand, and the suspect used the opportunity to flee. Joe wanted to give chase, but Henry stopped her immediately. She had already been exposed to the poison, and if it entered her bloodstream, she'd only have a minute to live. In a rush, Henry began searching the house for something to neutralize the poison. With quick actions, Joe was saved from danger, and the police soon secured the scene. They identified the suspect as a chemistry expert. 2 years ago, his wife accidentally fell onto the train tracks, and it was this very conductor who ran her over. Although the suspect had escaped, the case seemed closed to the police. They believed it was a long-planned act of revenge. However, Henry wasn't convinced. He suspected the killer's true target was him. After spending a few days with Henry, Joe's opinion of him began to change. Just then, the phone rang. It was a colleague informing them that a large number of poison barrels had been found in the suspect's home. However, the poison, along with the chemistry expert, had disappeared. It was clear that he had bigger plans. In the house, Henry discovered several blueprints. One of them, featuring a whale, caught his attention. It reminded him of the design on the ceiling of Central Station. He and Joe rushed to the train station, which was crowded with people. Observing the chilly temperature, Henry deduced that the suspect must be planning to disperse the poison through the air conditioning system. Together, they climbed to the roof, where the ventilation system was located. Sure enough, the chemistry expert appeared from behind and shot Joe, leaving her unconscious. He then threatened Henry, demanding his help. Henry tried to persuade him to surrender with words, but blinded by hatred, the chemistry expert was beyond reason. There was no way he would give up so easily. In desperation, Henry grabbed a wrench and swung it at him. In the ensuing struggle, a gunshot rang out and Henry collapsed, shot. Believing Henry was no longer a threat, the expert continued with his plan to release the poison. But to his surprise, Henry painfully stood up and grabbed him, dragging him off the roof. Both men plunged to their deaths. The next day, Joe woke up in the hospital, and the first person she saw was Henry. After dying, Henry had revived once again in the river. Curious, Jo asked what happened after he was shot. Henry fabricated a story saying that the chemistry expert had a change of heart and jumped to his death out of guilt. Jo, however, felt that Henry was hiding something from her. Just then, the phone rang again. Henry handed it to Jo, but to her surprise, the call was for him. As Henry took the phone, he realized it was the mysterious caller. The person on the other end mentioned seeing Henry fall to his death the previous night. Henry, frustrated, asked what they wanted. The mysterious person replied he wanted death. It turned out that this person, like Henry, was also immortal, a revelation that shook Henry to his core down to his smelly butt. He had always believed he was the only one cursed with eternal life. As Henry stepped out of the hospital room, he looked at the patient being resuscitated nearby, and his mind drifted back to memories from many years ago. It was during World War II when he saw a woman in a military camp carrying a small child in her arms, desperately searching for a doctor. Henry was captivated by her at first sight. That woman later became his wife, and the child in her arms is now Abe. The scene shifts to a man who had an axe lodged in his forehead. Sounds like an obvious cause of death. But Henry disagreed. He claimed the man died by accident, which left the sheriff and Jo in shock. But Henry explained the man was likely a football fan, judging by his clothes. There had been a game the night before, and after an intense match and too many drinks, the man got a bit reckless. His neighborhood had experienced a blackout, and he must have thought his TV antenna was broken. So he climbed a ladder with the axe, intending to trim the branches obstructing the signal. After swinging the axe a few times, he lost his balance and fell off the ladder. The axe slid down the roof and struck him square in the forehead. So in a way, his weight and gravity murdered him. It wasn't a pretty death, but it was purely accidental. After Henry's explanation, the sheriff had no words but felt relieved, because an accident meant he could head home to his wife sooner. But just as the sheriff was about to leave, Henry called him back and brought him to a female corpse. He told the sheriff that her death was suspicious. The night before, this woman had been sitting in a taxi, talking on the phone and muttering something to herself. She suddenly screamed hysterically at the driver, demanding to get out of the car, but since the car was on a bridge, the driver couldn't stop. So the woman jumped out of the moving taxi, ran to the edge of the bridge, and jumped off to her death. Many witnesses saw the entire event unfold, but Henry insisted it was murder. The sheriff was baffled again. Henry then showed the sheriff the woman's fingernails, which were covered in paint, indicating that before her death, she had tightly gripped the steel beams beneath the bridge. Based on the fractures in her hands and stinky feet, Henry deduced that she had landed in the water on her back. No one would rotate in midair during a suicide. The sheriff was skeptical, but Jo trusted Henry and decided to launch an investigation. The sheriff's peaceful evening was officially ruined. Back at the police station, Jo's supervisor learned about the case and opposed her pursuing it, given the already high number of homicide cases. He didn't want her wasting time on what seemed like a suicide. Soon after, the forensic department received a notice from the police, urging them to classify the case as suicide. Lucas mentioned that the victim's parents wanted to meet him. Henry, who typically avoids meeting families due to the emotional toll, was caught off guard when the grieving parents walked in themselves. Faced with their questions, Henry didn't know how to respond. That night, Henry decided to investigate the case himself. He returned to the bridge where the incident occurred, climbed over the railing to the bridge's underside, and found scratches, just as he had suspected. He also discovered footprints that weren't the woman's, indicating that someone else, possibly the killer, had been there. Continuing his search, he found a latch that didn't match the rusty old bridge. When Henry tried to remove it, he pulled too hard, lost his balance, and ended up hanging precariously from the bridge. Although he wouldn't die if he fell, he figured one less death was better. Struggling back up, Henry finally made it to the bridge deck and was about to ride away on his Tesla bike without battery when a speeding truck slammed into him, killing him instantly. Abe arrived just in time to collect Henry. This was the 22nd time Henry had died. But it wasn't all for nothing. He had confirmed that the woman was indeed murdered. Back at the office in the morgue, Henry found a wrapped gift box on his desk. Given that he had no friends, this took him by surprise. Cautiously, he opened it to find nothing but a note from the mysterious person. The note revealed that the sender knew about Henry's death the previous night. On the surface, it seemed like a condolence, but it was actually a taunt. Not only did the mysterious person know Henry's secret of immortality, but the person was also monitoring his every move. This revelation left Henry uncomfortable. Someone knew everything about him while he knew nothing about them. Henry's adopted son Abe was the only other person, aside from the mysterious figure, who knew Henry's secret. Abe examined the note and discovered that the paper was extremely old. Being knowledgeable about antiques, Abe set off to investigate its origin at Henry's request. Meanwhile, Jo arrived at the antique shop with a new lead. She discovered that the deceased had booked a flight before her death, something that seemed odd for someone planning suicide. Jo and Henry decided to investigate further. They visited the victim's dormitory, where they unexpectedly encountered her family. After a brief conversation, they didn't learn much, except that the victim had been working on a thesis. She and several classmates, along with a professor, had been translating an ancient manuscript recently discovered in Egypt. Following this lead, they sought out the professor. Through careful observation, Henry deduced that the professor was having an affair with one of the female students, but he didn't reveal this immediately. Instead, he secretly took the professor's chewed pen, which had traces of his DNA. Henry compared this DNA to the tissue found under the victim's nails, and it was a match. With this evidence in hand, Henry went to question the professor's wife. The wife claimed they had been watching a play together on the night of the murder, but Henry quickly caught her lie. On the table were 2 tickets, one creased and the other completely untouched. This meant she had attended the play alone. Additionally, the dusty state of the photos around the room suggested their marriage was in trouble. She had discovered her husband's infidelity, but to maintain her family's reputation, she chose to cover for him. With this new information, the professor became the prime suspect and was brought in for questioning. Although he denied killing the student, he did confess to the affair. Like a crocodile, the professor tearfully admitted that he loved the girl, but had broken up with her because he didn't want to waste her youth. The sheriff was skeptical. Why would a man end things with a young, beautiful woman? But Henry could tell the professor wasn't lying. After 200 years, spotting the truth had become second nature to him. Back at the antique shop, Abe returned with information on the mysterious note. The paper had been produced by a paper mill in Milan, which had been destroyed during World War II. It seemed both sides of this mystery were at a stalemate. The next day, Henry went back to the morgue. If the professor wasn't the killer, then the DNA from the professor on the victim was likely from their intimate relationship, meaning there must be another clue on her body. Henry pried open the victim's mouth and found additional evidence inside. Just as he was preparing to compare this DNA to the professor's, they received news that the professor had died. The police found his suicide note on the table, and there were no signs of a struggle at the scene. It appeared to be a suicide, but Henry disagreed. He insisted the professor had been murdered. Examining the scene, Henry deduced that the professor had been sedated based on the blood evidence and that the cuts on his wrists were made from the inside out, contrary to how suicides are typically performed. Henry also concluded that the killer was left-handed. The sheriff, incredulous, asked how he could know that. Henry held up the professor's suicide note and pointed out the handwriting. Thanks to Henry's keen observations, the crime scene was now treated as a murder investigation. Jo then launched her own investigation. In the surveillance footage, a figure caught her attention. Zooming in, she was shocked to see the professor's wife. Just as the police were preparing to bring her in for questioning, Jo saw something alarming on the live surveillance feed. A man had a knife to Henry's throat. As it turned out, while Jo was reviewing the footage, Henry had discovered a clue in the professor's thesis and sought out a teaching assistant to confirm his theory. The assistant had also been involved in the research of the ancient manuscripts. During this time, the female student and the professor had started an affair and even planned to co-author the paper. Feeling betrayed, the teaching assistant decided he couldn't take it anymore. He lured the girl to the bridge, calling her and claiming he was about to jump. The girl rushed to stop him, but when she arrived, he pushed her off the bridge, making her death look like a suicide. He then killed the professor and staged the scene to look like a suicide out of guilt. It was a brilliant plan, but Henry had unraveled it. Realizing he was caught, the teaching assistant confessed everything and grabbed a knife, holding it to Henry's throat. Henry didn't resist because he knew there were police outside. If he died here, his secret of immortality would be exposed. The assistant forced Henry out of the room, but Jo and the police had already arrived. The assistant was prepared for a last stand. In a bold move, Henry told the sheriff to shoot him in the shoulder. The sheriff took the shot, killing the teaching assistant while the bullet grazed Henry's neck. If the shot had been off by even 1 centimeter, Henry would have had to demonstrate his immortality in front of everyone. With the case solved, Henry returned the victim's belongings to her parents. Back at home, Henry received another call from the mysterious person. Henry asked to meet in person, but the request was denied. However, he did learn an earth-shattering secret. The mysterious person had been alive for over 2,000 years. The scene shifts to a 67-year-old man, surprisingly sporting 8-pack abs, who died under mysterious circumstances. Last night, after getting out of a car in Chinatown, a thief snatched his briefcase. Despite being old, the old man chased the thief down like a speeding Tesla bike and began beating him mercilessly. The thief begged for mercy, but suddenly the old man started convulsing, his nose running and bleeding profusely, and then he collapsed, dead like a piece of soap. Henry performed the old man's autopsy and found no external injuries. Meanwhile, Joe caught the thief, but Henry insisted that the thief had nothing to do with the man's death. He examined the old man's brain and made a startling discovery. Despite his youthful physique, his brain was extremely aged. His body looked like that of a 30-year-old, but his brain was as old as 100, even though he was only 67. Additionally, his stomach contained nothing but a milky mixture. At that moment, the old man's son arrived. When Henry showed him a photo of his father, he was shocked and said that the man in the picture didn't resemble his father. He explained that after his mother's death, his father had changed, becoming unrecognizably youthful. He believed that his father had forgotten both his mother and him. With the son's consent, Joe opened the briefcase, which contained a photo, proving the old man had not forgotten his late wife. They also found a business card and a large amount of cash, raising questions about where the old man was headed that night. Henry and Joe went to the scene of the incident. Using his sharp observational skills, Henry identified where the old man had gotten out of the car. But what had brought the old man to that spot? At that moment, a wealthy-looking woman across the street caught Henry's eye. Like the old man, she seemed out of place in the rundown neighborhood. Perhaps they shared a similar purpose. Henry followed the woman to a building, which turned out to be impeccably clean and luxurious inside. A video explained that the clinic sold youth and vitality. They found the doctor in charge and questioned him. He revealed that the clinic offered an expensive drug that made people younger, explaining how the old man had such a fit body. Henry, however, questioned the drug's side effects. Joe requested a sample of the drug for testing, but the doctor refused without a warrant. Meanwhile, Henry spotted the wealthy woman at the reception desk purchasing a large quantity of the drug. Seizing the moment, Henry turned on the charm and approached her. As a staff member pushed a cart past, Henry lightly pulled the woman aside, causing her purse to spill. Henry quickly helped her gather her belongings, and instead of being upset, the woman seemed rather pleased. Henry's irresistible charm at work. Joe, watching from a distance, thought they were flirting. However, Henry discreetly showed her the vial of the drug he had swiped, while Joe had managed to lift the doctor's fingerprints. That night, Henry analyzed the drug and was shocked to find that the expensive treatment was made of extremely cheap ingredients. Joe's fingerprint analysis also revealed the doctor's real identity, who had no formal medical training. 2 years ago, he ran a nursing home where 2 patients died under suspicious circumstances. Now, after undergoing plastic surgery, he had reappeared, making a fortune from the clinic, and had bought a lavish mansion by the sea. At that very moment, the doctor was hosting a luxurious party at his home, unaware that death was creeping closer. Henry and Joe arrived to question him. As the doctor went upstairs to change clothes, Henry noticed the wealthy woman again, but this time she didn't seem to recognize him. Suddenly, a scream echoed from upstairs. Henry and Joe rushed up to find the doctor lying in a pool of diabetic blood. They had been waiting right by the stairs, so how had the killer entered the room? And more importantly, how had they escaped? Henry discovered a broken scalpel blade in the wound, suggesting that the killer had a medical background. Beyond that, they had no other clues. Back at the morgue, Henry examined the doctor's body and found that he too had taken the rejuvenation drug, which had caused damage to his brain. However, when they tested the drug, no issues were detected. Henry quickly sought out Joe and explained his theory. He believed the drug contained prions. Prions aren't bacteria or viruses, but rather misfolded proteins, which is why traditional tests wouldn't detect them. When a person is infected with prions, it attacks the nervous system and damages the brain. Prions are found in human neural tissue, meaning the drug contained human brain matter. They wondered where they were getting the human brains. Suddenly, Henry rushed back to the morgue and asked Lucas how many bodies had gone missing. Lucas was surprised by the question, admitting that several bodies had mysteriously disappeared recently. Under Henry's interrogation, Lucas revealed that 12 bodies had gone missing. Based on this information, Henry quickly suspected the man responsible for transporting the corpses. Joe tracked the man down while he was transporting more bodies, and upon opening the truck, they found corpses with their brains removed. During interrogation, the man confessed to killing the doctor and claimed that he had invented the rejuvenation drug. But Henry could tell that the man lacked the medical knowledge necessary to create such a drug. Just then, a police officer brought in the client list from the rejuvenation clinic, and to Henry's shock, Abe's name was on it. Fearing for his adopted son's safety, Henry rushed back to the antique shop, quickly sending the customers away. He anxiously asked Abe if he had ever taken the rejuvenation drug. Luckily, Abe, despite loving to be young and youthful again, had been skeptical of the clinic's claims and refused to take the drug, even after they tried to convince him. Abe even brought in a female chemist to explain the risks. Henry asked if Abe remembered what the chemist looked like. Later, at the police station, they began working on a sketch of the chemist's appearance. Using advanced facial recognition software, they discovered that the suspect was the man's sister. After the sketch was completed, Abe planned to take the subway home. To his surprise, he encountered none other than the very woman he had just helped identify. Abe quickly called Henry and followed her onto the subway. Sensing that Abe was tailing her, the woman exited the train, and Abe followed her off as well. Watching her walk away, Abe asked subway security to detain the woman. When the guards asked what crime she had committed, Abe bluntly said, "She's been harvesting human brains." The security guards stared at him in disbelief, assuming he was crazy like a mad cow. Fortunately, Henry arrived just in time and continued the chase. Since they had briefly met at the party, the woman immediately recognized Henry. She explained that when she first developed the rejuvenation drug, she had no idea it would be used to harm people. Someone had threatened to report her to immigration if she didn't comply. Joe arrived at the scene just as a train approached. In a panic, the woman tried to throw herself in front of the train, but Henry managed to pull her heavy body back, saving her heavy life. The scene shifts to an elderly woman from a wealthy family celebrating her 90th birthday. What was meant to be a grand charity gala turned out to be her final day as she mysteriously passed away. Given the significance of the case, everyone expected Henry to investigate, but instead, he sent his assistant to the scene. Lucas could only conclude that it was a murder, but lacked further insight. Henry wasn't unavailable, but rather grieving. It turns out that in her youth, the elderly woman, Gloria, had been one of Henry's close friends. Back in the morgue, Henry performed Gloria's autopsy and discovered extensive soft tissue bruising on her body. Joe confronted Henry, asking why he didn't go to the crime scene himself. Henry replied that he didn't like that particular museum. Just then, a beautiful woman entered the lounge, and Lucas, eager to impress her using his muscles, told her he was the lead forensic investigator on the case. When the woman asked for the cause of death, he confidently declared it was murder. To his surprise, the woman turned out to be a reporter, and soon the newspapers were filled with stories about the case. The wealthy family valued their privacy, and Gloria's son soon arrived at the police station, furious. Though Henry had stayed home, the fallout from Lucas's comments landed on him, and Gloria's son demanded that the sheriff remove Henry from the case. Given the family's wealth and influence, the sheriff had no choice but to comply. Determined to continue the investigation, Henry secretly accompanied Joe to the museum. After inspecting the scene, Henry realized it was not the location where Gloria had initially been injured. His mind replayed the events of the night, piecing together clues from her bruises and the scene. Henry concluded that Gloria had been pushed down a flight of stairs. However, the security guard's testimony stated that Gloria had been alone. Henry insisted the guard was wrong. While Detective Jo remained skeptical, she received a call from the sheriff. Through surveillance footage, the sheriff had found evidence of someone following Gloria, and soon the suspect was brought into the interrogation room. The man, named Lance, denied being the murderer. It turned out Gloria's granddaughter had fallen in love with this poor man, but her father disapproved. Desperate, Lance had intended to ask Gloria for her blessing. From Lance's account, Henry could tell he wasn't lying. Lance explained that Gloria had been sweating profusely and slurring her words, and he mentioned smelling something burning. Henry immediately suspected that Gloria had suffered a temporal lobe stroke, likely triggered by some kind of medication. Henry planned to perform a liver biopsy on Gloria, but the body had already been transferred to the mortuary. Hearing that Gloria's house was about to be auctioned off, Henry sent Abe to the estate to photograph any medications she had been using. Soon after, Abe sent back the photos, but none of the medications matched Henry's suspicions. Meanwhile, Henry noticed Gloria's son pressuring the sheriff in the office, demanding that Lance be charged immediately. Observing the tremor in the man's hands, Henry suspected he had epilepsy. He then asked what medication the man was taking. Henry concluded that this medication had inadvertently killed his mother. At that moment, Gloria's will was revealed. Surprisingly, her caregiver inherited the entire estate, placing the son, Lance, and the caregiver all under suspicion. The key to solving the case now lay in determining where and when Gloria had taken her medication, which would ultimately reveal the true culprit. Henry arrived at Gloria's estate to continue his investigation. In the fireplace, he discovered a partially burned letter with a signature that matched one found on a painting at the museum. In the back seat of Gloria's car, Henry found her medication, and suddenly, everything clicked. He gathered everyone at the museum and revealed his conclusion: Gloria had committed suicide. Knowing her time was running out, Gloria chose to end her life in the museum because it housed a painting by her former lover. The sheriff asked if Henry had any concrete evidence. Henry turned his gaze toward Gloria's son, who seemed to understand what Henry had uncovered. The son then revealed a long-buried family secret. When Gloria was young, she had fallen in love with a painter, but her father discovered the relationship and threatened to ruin the artist. Gloria had no choice but to break things off. The son believed that after so many years his mother had moved on, but in truth, Gloria had never forgiven her father for forcing her to give up the love of her life. What first appeared to be a tragic accident turned out to be a heartbreaking love story. The scene shifts to a murder taking place in an old neighborhood, but since the victim had no known background or influence, the police weren't planning to investigate further. However, Henry wasn't about to give up. The victim's body had been badly disfigured by rats, so Henry decided to search the rats for clues. To his surprise, he found a lottery ticket and a boxer's ring inside one of the rats' stomachs. Henry and Joe followed the lead to a local boxing gym, where they learned that the victim, Raul, had worked. It was revealed that Raul had been in a heated argument over the phone before his death. The investigation uncovered that a developer had plans to tear down the dilapidated neighborhood for redevelopment, but Raul, who had grown up there, fiercely opposed it. Henry noticed a wound on Raul's forehead. When questioned, a man from the gym said the injury was from teaching boxing. Henry didn't pursue the matter further, but Joe followed up with a visit to a local grocery store, where she learned that Raul had bought the lottery ticket there. The shopkeeper, however, couldn't offer any new leads, only mentioning that the neighborhood was about to be demolished. He couldn't understand why Raul was fighting to stop it, since the area was crime-ridden and far from idyllic. Next, Henry and Joe visited the developer's construction site, where the foreman was less than welcoming. Joe had to reveal her identity as a detective to gain access. Henry noticed that the asphalt on the ground matched the material found on Raul's shoes, suggesting this was the actual crime scene. Raul's missing phone was still unaccounted for, and Henry guessed it was somewhere nearby. He asked Joe to call Raul's phone. Although the call connected, they couldn't hear the ringtone. Trusting his instincts, Henry grabbed a shovel and started digging around the site. At this point, the boss showed up, visibly upset and threatening to report them if they didn't stop digging. Undeterred, Henry kept searching and finally unearthed Raul's phone. With the phone in hand, the site was now confirmed as the location of Raul's death. However, the boss claimed not to know who Raul was. Joe then called the last contact on Raul's phone, and to everyone's surprise, the boss's phone started ringing. Caught in a blatant lie, the boss was taken in for questioning. During the interrogation, the boss admitted he received angry calls from many people daily, often from individuals who didn't give their names. It sounded plausible enough, and since they had no concrete evidence, they had no choice but to release him. The police assumed someone like the boss, with his wealth and status, wouldn't personally commit murder. Joe then focused on investigating the boss's men, suspecting the foreman was involved due to his criminal record. She and Henry decided to monitor his actions closely. Their surveillance soon paid off. They observed the boss secretly handing a suspicious package to the foreman. Following the foreman, they watched as he took the package into a gym, only to leave empty-handed. Henry and Joe snuck into the gym and found the package in a locker. Inside, they discovered a large sum of cash. Convinced they had uncovered the truth, Henry gathered Raul's colleague at the morgue and confronted one of them, accusing him of betraying his friend for money. Henry also found human tissue inside Raul's ring, suggesting Raul had confronted the man before his death, which led to a fight. The wound on the man's face had been caused by Raul. Despite the evidence, the man still denied killing Raul. Later, Henry returned to the crime scene where he spotted a young boy playing with a ball. He struck up a conversation asking if the boy had seen Raul on the night of the murder. The boy glanced over his shoulder, suddenly terrified, and hurried away on his bike. Confused, Henry followed his gaze and saw the foreman nearby. He He also noticed ball marks on a metal gate, similar to those in Raoul's apartment. It dawned on Henry that the boy had been in the apartment that night and knew who the killer was. Henry and Joe quickly set out to find the boy, but all they found was his abandoned bike by the roadside. He had been kidnapped, likely by the foreman. Joe immediately alerted her colleagues to track the foreman's vehicle. The sheriff, while on duty, spotted the car and gave chase, pulling it over. However, when the foreman opened the trunk, it was empty. The sheriff reported the result to Joe, leaving them puzzled as to what went wrong. Henry, deep in thought, recalled that if the boy wasn't scared of the foreman, then the only other person in that direction was the grocery store owner who had sold Raoul the lottery ticket. Henry and Joe went to the grocery store but found it suspiciously closed in broad daylight. Remembering that the owner supported the redevelopment project, Henry began to suspect him. They forced their way into the store and headed to the basement, where they found the boy. The store owner was interrogating him, demanding to know what he had told the police. The terrified boy insisted he hadn't said anything, but the owner, not believing him, was about to shoot when Henry intervened. Realizing his actions had been exposed, the owner made a run for it. He barely made it outside when Henry caught up to him. In a panic, the owner tried to shoot Henry, but in his haste, he didn't notice an oncoming truck, which hit him, killing him instantly. Before dying, the store owner admitted that the foreman had orchestrated everything. It turns out, the store owner had grown disillusioned with the run-down neighborhood, as his shop was frequently targeted by thieves and criminals. He wanted the area redeveloped, but Raoul had opposed the project. At the foreman's behest, the store owner had killed Raoul, making him just a pawn in the foreman's scheme. Despite the revelation, there was no concrete evidence tying the foreman directly to the murder, so he was only arrested on bribery charges and would likely be released soon. Some things never change. Over 200 years, Henry had witnessed countless similar situations. As a gesture of hope, Joe took Henry to the newly renovated boxing gym, where local kids from the neighborhood could now play. She told Henry that at least this has changed. Later, Joe dropped Henry off at the antique shop, and Henry invited her to stay for dinner. Since his wife's death, he had been single for over 60 years, and this was the first time he'd invited a woman home. Over dinner, Joe asked how Henry and Abe had met. Both men were caught off guard, realizing they couldn't exactly say the old man was the young man's father. As they awkwardly tried to spin a story, Joe seemed to catch on, asking if Abe had watched Henry grow up, assured that they must have a lot of stories together. The scene shifts to a mysterious package arriving at the police station, and to everyone's shock, blood was leaking from it. When Henry opened it, he found a human heart inside. After conducting tests, Henry determined it belonged to a young woman and that the heart had been removed while she was still alive. However, without the rest of the body, there were few other clues to go on. Joe began investigating recent missing persons cases and found 4 potential matches. Henry closely examined their photos, and based on the heart's health and appearance, he was able to narrow it down to a prostitute. They headed to the hotel where the prostitute worked and questioned the doorman. Upon hearing about her disappearance, he seemed visibly saddened. 3 days earlier, the prostitute had left the hotel, tipping him $100, as she was known for her generosity. Henry followed the path the prostitute had taken, suspecting it was where she had been abducted. Nearby, he noticed a slaughterhouse and, thinking he was onto something, entered. Sure enough, they found the prostitute's body inside. Upon examining the body, Henry discovered the killer had been mimicking Jack the Ripper's methods in gruesome detail, down to every last cut. Even the prostitute's name matched one of Jack the Ripper's victims, further confirming the copycat nature of the crime. The past case had taken place in 1888 London, and Henry had been present at the scene. Though the real Jack the Ripper was never caught, Henry still remembered it vividly, even after more than a century. Just then, Joe's phone rang. It was a call for Henry. To his surprise, the mysterious caller was on the line. Henry was shocked, wondering how this person could possibly know about the prostitute's murder. The crime scene had been sealed off. Even more astonishing was that the mysterious caller knew about Jack the Ripper from over a century ago. Henry began scanning the crowd, suspecting the mysterious figure might be nearby. He spotted a phone just before the caller hung up, but it was too late. He had missed the chance to catch him. Back at the antique shop, Henry found himself questioning everything. The 2 cases had identical methods, and there was only one explanation. It had to be the work of the mysterious man. After all, only someone who had lived for over 2,000 years, like the mysterious figure, could have pulled this off. Henry couldn't tell the police about his theory. If they found out he had lived for 2 centuries, he would become a subject of scientific study. Now, Henry had no choice but to catch the mysterious man on his own. Returning to the morgue, Henry began examining the body, comparing it to the notes from the Jack the Ripper case he had personally recorded over 100 years ago. His notebook contained every detail of the original crimes. He told Joe that the murder methods were identical, with no traces left behind. Joe was astonished, asking how he could have a notebook from a century ago. Henry explained that Jack the Ripper was a case all forensic experts studied. He suspected that the killer had studied the same material, as it was the only way to replicate every detail and incision so perfectly, right down to the star-shaped symbol carved on the victim's arm. Henry suddenly recalled that the original victim from over 100 years ago had a moon-shaped mark, not a star. At the time, a newspaper had been reporting on the case outside the scene. Henry sighed in relief. It wasn't the mysterious man after all. The original killer had marked his victim with a moon, but an error in the newspaper misreported it as a star. The current killer must have been influenced by that mistake, having read the misprinted article. The newspaper went out of business in 1889, but only the library would still have records from that time. They headed to an old library. While reviewing the borrowing records, Joe made a discovery. A man named Ryan had checked out the newspaper a month ago. Henry, however, pointed out that Ryan was likely a pseudonym. 100 years ago, the lead investigator on the Jack the Ripper case had also been named Ryan. Joe thought the trail had gone cold, but Henry spotted a clue in the signature. Ryan's handwriting matched that of someone named Hank, who had borrowed a different newspaper earlier that morning and hadn't yet returned it. That meant Hank could still be in the library. They began scanning the readers, searching for anyone acting suspiciously. Suddenly, a young man started to look nervous, hurriedly packing his things and bolting for the door. Joe immediately gave chase. Half an hour later, Joe successfully apprehended him. Meanwhile, Henry noticed that the man had dropped his bag. As he prepared to inspect it, his phone rang. It was the mysterious man. The call was no accident. The mysterious figure had left the phone on purpose. He revealed that he had been at the crime scene and wanted to help Henry solve the case. The mysterious caller claimed that the killer wasn't just copying Jack the Ripper. He had left clues indicating his next crime, a reenactment of the Black Dahlia murder. During the interrogation, the young man denied being the killer. He revealed that he was a writer researching Jack the Ripper for a book, which explained why he had been studying the case files. As for the knife he carried, it was merely a prop to help him immerse himself in the role for inspiration. When asked why he had run from Joe, he said he had mistaken her for a fan. But as ridiculous as his excuse seemed, Henry noticed an important detail. The man's work contained an incredibly detailed account of the murder. Henry realized that the killer might be a fan of this writer's work. The suspect had been making reckless comments online, which quickly caught the attention of the task force. Armed to the teeth, they stormed in, seizing the man's keyboard. But just then, the control room reported that the real target was still typing. There was someone else. The sheriff led the team to the second floor, and sure enough, they found another person. It turns out, a new murder had recently occurred, with the killer mimicking the brutal methods of the Black Dahlia case. The task force suspected the killer might be a fan of the writer, as someone had left a comment online claiming to have committed the murder in the same fashion as the Black Dahlia. The young man they arrested was named Devin, and despite the seriousness of the situation, he brazenly flirted with Joe, clearly a reckless move. Devin was accused of being the killer, but instead of being scared, he seemed to relish the attention, thinking it might make him an internet sensation. Devin's parents arrived at the station, demanding their son's release, but were denied. The footprints at the crime scene matched Devin's, and Henry had discovered that the murder weapon was an antique knife. The owner of the antique shop, an old friend of Abe's, revealed that the buyer of the knife was also named Devin. Abe snuck out the shop's ledger, confirming the sale. Henry advised Devin's father to hire a lawyer as soon as possible. Then, Henry visited the antique shop, hoping the shop owner could identify the suspect. However, she claimed that the person who bought the knife was a middle-aged man, not Devin. Suddenly, it dawned on Henry it was Devin's father. He rushed out of the shop, but before he could get far, he was stabbed in the side by none other than Devin's father. Henry knew he had about 8 minutes before he would bleed out, but then Devin's father twisted the knife, reducing his time to just 4 minutes. At that moment, Joe called Abe to ask for the address of the antique shop. Meanwhile, Henry was struggling to stay conscious on the floor, while the killer entered the shop, tying up the shop owner with the intention of silencing her for good. Barely able to move, Henry crawled into the shop, summoning the last of his strength to fight the killer. The two tumbled down the stairs, driving the knife even deeper into Henry's side. Henry, now in shock and on the brink of death, was fading fast. After the fall, the killer got up, stomped on Henry's back for good measure, and headed upstairs to finish off the shop owner. Just then, Jo arrived, unaware of what had happened. When she saw the man reaching for his gun, she acted quickly and shot him dead, sending him to hell to assassinate Satan. Meanwhile, Henry lay helpless on the ground. He wasn't afraid of dying, but he was terrified that Jo might discover his secret. As he awaited what seemed inevitable, someone else entered. It's not Jo, but the mysterious man. Upstairs, Jo was rescuing the shop owner, completely unaware that Henry was in the basement. The mysterious man knew Jo would eventually find Henry, and revealing the secret would benefit no one. He pulled the knife from Henry's side and without hesitation slit Henry's chicken throat. Moments later, Henry revived in the water. Surprisingly, Henry felt a strange sense of gratitude toward the mysterious man for killing him. He feared the discovery of his secret far more than death itself. But from the precise manner in which the mysterious man had cut his throat, Henry realized the mysterious man clearly possessed a high level of medical knowledge. The scene shifts to Tyler, the son of a billionaire, who had just won an award for being one of New York's top doctors. Yet moments after receiving the trophy, he was found dead in his apartment, killed by that very same award. Despite his wealthy background, Tyler had chosen to live a modest life in a humble community, fully dedicated to his work. He was known as a good man with a heart for helping others. After investigating the scene, Henry concluded that Tyler had been murdered by someone he knew. Henry and Jo attended Tyler's memorial service in search of clues. One detail caught Henry's eye. 3 people were wearing rings identical to Tyler's. Henry noticed that Paul, one of the attendees, appeared to be a drug addict, so he decided to question him first. Just as they were about to speak, a lawyer classmate interrupted, warning them that this was her friend's memorial, and they should be respectful. The other girl, on the other hand, was more polite, apologizing on behalf of her friends. She had been the one to present Tyler with his award, and all 3, Paul, the lawyer classmate, and the polite girl, were Tyler's college friends. Henry soon realized that the lawyer was romantically involved with both the polite girl and Tyler, while Paul secretly harbored feelings for the lawyer. The web of relationships was as complicated as it could get, and it seemed likely that one of them might be the killer. Soon after, the tech team recovered a video from Tyler's phone. In the video, Tyler began by apologizing to a couple and was about to reveal a secret when Paul abruptly interrupted. Clearly, something was being hidden. Henry and Jo went to Paul's apartment where they found the door ajar. Inside, Paul was unconscious from an overdose. Henry performed first aid and paramedics soon arrived to take Paul to the hospital. In Paul's apartment, Henry made a crucial discovery, an outdoor hiking book and muddy boots. He deduced that Paul had been out in the wilderness 2 days earlier. Jo also found a record showing that Paul had bought a canister of gasoline around the same time. They headed to the gas station and checked the surveillance footage, which showed Paul throwing something into a trash bin. Upon inspection, they found it was a shovel. Henry now had a theory. A team of sheriffs followed Henry into the woods. From a distance, Henry noticed a small tree that seemed unusually lush for being only 10 years old. He suspected the tree was thriving because of some special fertilizer beneath it. Sure enough, a body was uncovered beneath the tree, remains of someone who had gone missing 9 years earlier. Jo summoned the 3 suspects and they finally confessed. 9 years ago, after a night of drinking and reckless behavior, the lawyer classmate, while driving, kissed Tyler in the back seat and then the polite girl in the front, fully indulging in her selfish whims. Amid the distraction, they accidentally hit a child who died on the spot. With no witnesses around, they decided to bury the child's body in secret. The guilt had weighed on them ever since. Tyler had a complete change of heart, becoming a doctor and donating all his earnings to charity, but it wasn't enough to ease his conscience. When he finally decided to confess, he was murdered before he could do so. Though the suspects admitted to the hit and run, they denied killing Tyler. As Henry examined a photo of the child, something clicked. The emblem on the boy's hat matched the logo of the gas station. It turned out that the boy had once worked at the gas station, which was also on Tyler's list of donations. Henry and Jo returned to the gas station to question the owner. Sensing their suspicions, the owner excused himself to fetch something, but instead, he grabbed a gun. In the woods, Jo confronted the man, while a wounded Henry arrived on the scene. The truth was finally revealed. The gas station owner had witnessed the accident 9 years ago. He had been blackmailing Tyler ever since, knowing that Tyler's father was a billionaire. A few days before Tyler's murder, the owner had again demanded hush money, but Tyler, ready to confess, refused to pay this time. Enraged, the owner killed him. Just as the owner was about to shoot Henry, Jo acted swiftly, shooting and killing the owner, bringing the case to a close. The scene shifts to a broke man, determined to impress a girl, confidently telling the bartender he would cover everyone's drinks despite already running up quite a tab. The bartender refused, leaving him humiliated. Frustrated, the man stormed out to his car, only to be ambushed by someone in the back seat who strangled him with a garrote. When Henry arrived at the crime scene, the car had already been torched, and the victim was so badly burned that not even his mother would have recognized him. The sheriff suspected it was an accident, but Jo bet that Henry would declare it a murder. As expected, Henry noticed that the victim had no ash in his mouth, meaning the fire had been set after he died. Back at the forensic office, Henry found a saxophone reed inside the victim's mouth, a clue pointing to music. Meanwhile, Jo identified the victim through the car's VIN. Shortly after, the victim's family arrived, including his sister. The victim's father was a famous jazz musician, but due to the passage of time, none of them recognized each other. Later, Henry shared the case details with Abe, who surprisingly knew a lot about jazz. Abe had studied jazz in his youth, and one of the songs was considered a masterpiece among jazz fans. Henry, who had no clue about the song, felt frustrated. It was clear he had missed out on much of Abe's upbringing. With Abe's help, Henry and Jo visited a local jazz bar. Henry ordered a drink to distract the bartender, and while he was away, Henry found the victim's suitcase under the bar. The bartender explained that the victim had left it behind after failing to pay his debts. In the corner, Henry also found a guitar with a freshly replaced string, raising suspicion. The bartender was brought in for questioning as a potential suspect. The bartender denied killing the victim but revealed an intriguing secret. The victim had been telling people that his father was the true composer of the famous song and that the legendary jazz musician had stolen it from him. Henry found it hard to believe that someone would kill over a song, but the sheriff disagreed. He knew how much the song meant to the jazz world. It was more than just music. It was a legacy. Just then, Lucas reported the time of the victim's death, and the bartender had an airtight alibi, with multiple customers vouching for his presence at the bar. The killer had to be someone else. Henry and Jo visited a record company to question the owner, who denied any copyright dispute over the song, dismissing the victim's claims as fabrication. However, Henry noticed singed hair on the man's hand. The owner explained it was from a weekend barbecue, but Henry wasn't fully convinced. Burnt hair alone wasn't enough to charge him. Back at the crime lab, Henry and Lucas continued investigating the burned car. They recreated the scene with Lucas acting as the victim and Henry as the killer, hoping to uncover new clues. Their efforts paid off. Henry found a button on the floor mat and hidden inside the victim's bag, an original tape recording of the same song. The victim's father later came to the station, and to Henry's surprise, he admitted to being the real composer of the song. He deeply regretted telling his son the truth. When shown a photo of the button, he reacted with shock but denied ever seeing it before. That night, the victim's father went to the jazz bar, a gun hidden in his pocket. As he prepared to pull the trigger, Henry intervened just in time. It turned out the victim's father wanted to kill the son of the man who had stolen the rights to his song. The original thief had passed away, but his son had inherited the rights. When the victim found evidence of the original recording that could prove his father's authorship, the man killed the victim to protect the stolen legacy. With the truth finally revealed, it was hard not to feel sympathy for the victim's father. His life's greatest work had been stolen, and the thief's son had, in turn, taken his own son from him. The injustice of it all was overwhelming. A song that could have been his legacy was stolen, and the aftermath cost him far more than anyone could have imagined. The scene shifts to a British aristocrat who was about to get engaged to the daughter of a wealthy family. The girl's father spared no expense, hosting a lavish engagement party and even admitting he couldn't compare to the grandeur of the man's noble family. He believed his daughter would marry in a castle. However, there was a trace of worry on the man's face, and before anyone knew it, he was dead in Central Park. Jo and the sheriff were on the scene investigating because Henry was off that day. Immortality aside, even Henry needed a break sometimes. They found the man's passport, identifying him as a viscount from a British royal family. This was serious, so they called Henry to come in. Henry, being from London and with over 200 years of life experience, knew a great deal about royal history. One glance, and he realized the man wasn't royalty, he was an imposter. Moments later, the sheriff brought more confirmation. The British embassy had no record of this man. Back at the morgue, Henry examined the body. He noticed that the cuts on the man's neck weren't clean. The tool used to sever his throat wasn't a sharp blade. Traces of gold were found in the wound, and there were irregular abrasions on the man's calves. Henry also deduced from the man's oral structure that he was American, not British, as the oral differences between the two accents would leave distinct marks. But Jo couldn't find any records on him. It was as if this man didn't exist. The only lead they had left was his bespoke suit. Henry recognized the stitching technique. It was incredibly unique. Only one tailor in all of New York could have made it. They visited the tailor shop, where the owner warmly greeted Henry. It turned out that Henry's suits were also custom-made here, much to Jo's surprise. Who knew a forensic examiner could afford such luxury? Jo showed the owner a photo of the victim, and he instantly recognized him as a client who went by a fake name. The last time the client had visited, he had ordered a tailcoat for his wedding. Following this lead, they went to the marriage registry to inquire further. As they waited, Henry became oddly fixated on a young man's leg scars, staring intently. When the man left, Henry followed him outside, crouching down to examine his calf more closely. Understandably, this made the man uncomfortable. Luckily, Jo arrived just in time to save Henry from getting punched. Henry realized that the man's leg scar matched the abrasions on the victim's leg exactly. The man explained that the scar came from a bike chain, the same injury the victim had, whose real name was Wyatt. The man had grown up with Wyatt in a poor neighborhood, where Wyatt had once been a water delivery man before disappearing about a year ago. Since then, Wyatt had reinvented himself as a fake aristocrat, conning his way into high society. Jo later discovered that Wyatt was an orphan, taken in by different families throughout his childhood. His transformation into a British noble had been a long con. When Jo questioned his fiancée, the young and naive heiress was devastated. She couldn't believe any of it. Her perfect love story had been a complete lie. But as they say, every girl encounters a few bad apples. No matter how high the family's status, and scammers always find a way in. Among Wyatt's belongings, Henry found a check for a little over $8 million. The one who wrote the check was his future father-in-law. The fiancée confirmed it was for the wedding preparations. Heartbroken, she realized that what she thought was true love had all been a facade, and she had been completely fooled. Henry uncovered more clues from Wyatt's body, including a check stub for a large amount of money that led back to his fiancée's father, who had given it to Wyatt for the wedding. The fiancée was crushed, believing she had found true love, only to realize she had been played. The case was finally coming together. Wyatt's scheme was unraveling, and his real identity had been exposed, but who had murdered him and why? Henry and Jo arrived at the wealthy man's estate, which was grand and opulent. Upon entering, Henry noticed that the wealthy man had a back injury. The man explained it was from a golf injury and claimed he hadn't seen Wyatt since the engagement party. However, Henry could tell he was lying. Observing the room, Henry deduced that Wyatt had visited the study and gotten into a confrontation with the wealthy man. Wyatt had clearly overpowered him, resulting in the back injury. In retaliation, the wealthy man had struck Wyatt with a golf club. Stunned, the wealthy man wondered if Henry had hidden cameras in his home. He demanded to speak with his lawyer, knowing that with a good legal team, as long as there wasn't concrete evidence, they could smooth things over. In the interrogation room, the lawyer presented a legal statement. The wealthy man admitted to hitting Wyatt with the golf club, but insisted he didn't kill him. Under Jo's questioning, he recounted the events. After the engagement party, Wyatt confessed that everything about him was a lie, except for his love for the wealthy man's daughter. Instead of forgiving him, the wealthy man reacted with violence. Henry returned to the morgue for further clues and found fabric fibers in Wyatt's head wound, indicating that someone had bandaged him after the fight. Whoever did this was either the killer or an accomplice. It was clear now that someone had been helping Wyatt. A kid from the slums couldn't have convincingly impersonated a nobleman without training. Henry suspected something and found a fashion magazine featuring all the aristocratic items Wyatt had been purchasing. Among them was a pen, which Henry realized matched the gold particles found in Wyatt's neck wound. This was the murder weapon. Further investigation revealed that all of Wyatt's purchases had been made using an employee discount card, which led them to a woman who worked at the marriage registry. Henry and Jo went to the woman's house but found it empty. Inside, they discovered books, photos of Wyatt, and discarded bandages, all confirming Henry's suspicion that the woman had been Wyatt's accomplice. She had taken a poor kid and transformed him into an aristocrat. But things took an unexpected turn when she fell in love with her own creation, Wyatt, only to be heartbroken when he chose the wealthy heiress instead. The woman was now on the run. Later, Henry and Abe attended a funeral for an old friend, coincidentally held at the same time as Wyatt's. Henry noticed Wyatt's fiancée and the son of the family's lawyer both attending the service. As they left together, Henry spotted the woman nearby and immediately called Jo. Soon after, the woman was brought in for questioning. As they suspected, she had fallen in love with Wyatt, but she denied killing him. The case seemed to be back at square one. Henry, once again, pulled Lucas into a crime scene reenactment to piece together what had happened. To kill Wyatt with the pen would have required a force of over 100 pounds, far more than the woman could manage. This led Henry to suspect someone else. Jo and the sheriff arrested the wealthy man's daughter and confronted the lawyer's son, telling him they had found the murder weapon with his fingerprints on it. That night, the lawyer's son returned to the park, seemingly looking for something. When he found a pen hidden in the grass, it became clear he had been tricked. It was a police setup. The truth came out. The lawyer's son had also been in love with the heiress. In a fit of jealousy and anger, he had confronted Wyatt and, in a moment of rage, killed him. The scene shifts to a taxi driver who was on the phone when a passenger got into the back seat. Business as usual, the driver asked where the man wanted to go, but the passenger remained silent. Without warning, the man pulled out an ancient weapon and stabbed the driver through the chest. Meanwhile, Henry was saying goodbye to Jo and hailed a cab. To his shock, the driver was none other than the mysterious man who had lived for over 2,000 years. The mysterious man locked the doors and sped off, driving recklessly. He accused Henry of ignoring him and not believing in his immortality. To prove a point, he pulled out a gun, aimed it at his own head, and fired. In an instant, the mysterious man vanished from the driver's seat, but the car continued racing down the road. Everything happened so fast. With no one at the wheel, the car careened into a river, quickly sinking. Struggling to escape, Henry's antique watch slipped from his wrist. Locked in the car, no matter how much he fought, there was no way out. Soon, he drowned. Moments later, as usual, Henry revived in another river. It was only now that Henry fully realized how dangerous his opponent truly was. Despite being immortal, Henry still feared death. But the mysterious man could kill himself without hesitation, making him a truly terrifying and reckless adversary. Henry crawled up the riverbank only to be spotted by a patrolling sheriff. Once again, he was taken to the station. This wasn't the first time he'd been caught streaking. Henry explained as usual that he suffered from sleepwalking and liked to sleep naked, often waking up in random places near the river. The sheriff had plenty of questions, but there wasn't much he could do. Henry was too good at his job as a medical examiner. And so, Henry became the station's laughingstock. When the sheriff heard about it, he even bought Henry a pair of red underwear as a joke. Just as everyone was having a good laugh, the station received a report of a body found in a dumpster. The victim had been stabbed in the chest. Henry took one look and recognized the man. It was the taxi driver. He'd seen the driver's ID photo in the back of the cab. Without needing further examination, Henry knew it was the work of the mysterious man. But how could he explain that? He casually suggested to Lucas to check if a taxi has gone missing. Upon examining the stab wound, Henry noticed the precision and force were highly skilled, almost perfect. He shared his concerns with Abe, who was deeply worried. Henry was up against a 2,000-year-old monster, and Abe urged him to tell Jo the truth. Abe believed Jo could be trusted, but Henry was still hesitant. He had trusted people before, and it hadn't ended well. Not long after, the missing taxi was recovered from the river. Henry felt uneasy, knowing he had been in that very car, aware of everything that had happened but unable to share the truth. Instead, he had to carefully manipulate the narrative to fit the investigation. Jo spotted scratch marks inside the car and asked Henry to lift fingerprints, but Henry, knowing they were his own, claimed that the water had ruined the prints. At that moment, Henry saw his antique watch. He attempted to discreetly retrieve it, but Jo beat him to it. Smiling, she handed it back, joking that he must have accidentally dropped it. Later that night, Henry and Abe snuck back to the river to search for the mysterious man's antique gun. Just as Henry stripped down and was about to dive in, he was arrested again for public indecency. The sheriff's efficiency in catching Henry every time he streaked was remarkable. The sheriff, exasperated, confronted Henry. Henry tried to explain that he was working on a case, but the sheriff stopped his smelly bullshit, warning that next time even he wouldn't be able to help Henry. After being released, Jo was equally baffled. Henry explained he was trying to recover a weapon from the river, but she didn't buy it. She suggested that the stress of his job might be getting to him and even recommended seeing a psychologist. As a joke, she also mentioned getting some therapy, which to her surprise, Henry took seriously and actually visited a therapist. However, the therapist turned out to be a man from London who asked many odd questions. He wanted to be Henry's confidant, offering someone to talk to when things got tough. But Henry politely declined, saying he already had Abe and didn't need any more friends. Meanwhile, the sheriff found the antique gun in the river. When Jo realized Henry hadn't mentioned that it was an extremely old firearm, she grew suspicious. Further investigation revealed that the gun belonged to a stranger. When Jo and the sheriff went to his house, they were shocked to find the stranger dead, his body looking like it had been dissected. Jo immediately contacted Henry, who rushed to the scene. He clarified that this wasn't a post-mortem dissection. The stranger had been gutted while alive. Henry suspected the killer had used a hunting knife. At this realization, Henry's face showed disbelief, and he abruptly left the room. The sheriff was confused, while Jo recalled that Henry used a hunting knife for his autopsies. Henry hurried back to the morgue, opened his desk, and retrieved his autopsy tools. Relief washed over him as his knife was still there. However, on a whim, he inspected the hunting knife more closely and was horrified to find bloodstains on it. His worst fear had come true. The murder weapon was his own knife. Lucas noticed something was off about Henry, but he forced a smile and asked Lucas to handle the body alone while he rushed back to the antique shop, deeply troubled. Abe, having learned that the mysterious man was framing Henry, urged him to leave the city immediately. He believed that Henry couldn't face the mysterious man alone. Ironically, the same Abe who once encouraged Henry to stay was now advising him to flee. Abe even suggested that Henry share his secret with Jo, hoping she could help him. But Henry disagreed, convinced that Jo wouldn't believe the truth, and decided it was best to leave. Meanwhile, Jo went to the morgue, but Henry wasn't there. Lucas shared his observation with her. The killer's autopsy technique matched Henry's perfectly. Jo couldn't help but think that Lucas might as well accuse Henry directly. At that moment, Henry and Abe were packing up to flee the city, but Jo had already arrived at the antique shop. Henry hurriedly explained that things weren't what they seemed, and Jo demanded the truth. Abe also urged Henry to come clean. Faced with a difficult choice, Henry decided to keep his secret. He told Jo that the mysterious man was a mentally ill individual who believed he was immortal. The man had been stalking Henry and used his tools to commit the murders. Though there were holes in his story, the sheriff backed Henry and allowed him to stay and investigate the real culprit. Henry discovered that both of the recent victims had received hepatitis B vaccines and had once worked at the same psychiatric hospital. He and Jo visited the hospital, only to find out that both victims had left after having conflicts with the same patient. Without a warrant, however, the hospital refused to release any patient information. Running out of options, Henry thought of asking the therapist for help in accessing patient records. The therapist, eager to help, revealed that the patient's name was Walker. Walker believed he was immortal and had been found swimming naked in rivers multiple times, eerily similar to Henry's own experiences. Walker also had violent tendencies and came to the hospital for weekly therapy sessions. Jo asked when his next session was scheduled, and the therapist checked his computer. It was happening right now. Henry and Jo rushed to the hospital front desk to ask if Walker was still in therapy, but they were told he had just finished and left. Jo immediately hit the emergency button, locking down the hospital as the main doors began to close. Just then, Henry spotted a suspicious figure squeezing through the doors at the last moment. Trapped inside, Henry could only watch as the suspect escaped. Walker was now the prime suspect, and a citywide manhunt began. Henry, frustrated by how close they had come to the truth, asked Jo if she ever suspected him. Despite his odd behavior, Jo insisted that she never believed he was a killer, providing Henry with a small sense of relief. Back at the antique shop, Henry noticed that Abe was missing. When he went down to the basement, Walker suddenly appeared behind him. Panicked, Henry feared the worst, wondering if Abe had been harmed. Demanding answers, Henry confronted Walker, who shockingly pulled out an ancient sword and knelt before him, pleading for Henry to kill him. Henry, thinking Walker had lost his mind, refused. At that moment, Abe's voice called from upstairs, easing Henry's worry but also heightening the tension. He feared for Abe's safety. Both Henry and Walker lunged for the sword, wrestling each other in a chaotic struggle. Hearing the commotion, Abe rushed downstairs just as Henry grabbed a tool from the table and stabbed Walker in the heart. Walker collapsed, seemingly dead. But to Henry's surprise, he didn't disappear like the mysterious man would have, suggesting that Walker wasn't the mysterious man. Soon after, the police arrived. Believing Walker to be the serial killer, they assured Henry that it was an act of self-defense. But just then, Henry received a phone call from the mysterious man, revealing that Walker had been sent by him. The whole ordeal had been orchestrated to make Henry experience the act of killing. As Henry looked out the window, he was shocked. The mysterious man had revealed his true identity. He was none other than the therapist. The scene shifts to a robber bursting into a jewelry store, smashing glass display cases with a hammer, frantically grabbing whatever he could. Under one counter, he found a locked safe that screamed of high-value contents. When he pried it open, there it was, bags of sparkling diamonds. After cleaning out the store, he swung the hammer one last time, destroying the security cameras before making a swift exit. Later that night, a man dressed in black hurried to a house and anxiously knocked on the door. The door opened to reveal Joe's home, but no one was at the doorstep. Joe, perplexed, closed the door and went back to bed. The next morning, a murder was reported near her house, conveniently saving her some travel time. The sheriff saw tire marks at the scene and initially assumed it was a hit and run. But then Henry emerged from the bushes, explaining that the tire marks were from acceleration, not braking. He also found the victim's hat hidden in the grass, indicating that the man had been chased and killed. Back in the morgue, Henry discovered numerous old wounds on the victim's body, signs of a man who had taken many beatings. His wrists bore the marks of handcuffs, suggesting he was an ex-convict. Sure enough, the sheriff entered with a file. The victim was named Aaron, a career thief who had served time for illegal possession of firearms. He had been out on parole. As Joe scanned the file, her expression changed and she quickly walked away. It turned out that 3 years ago, Aaron had been arrested and sent to prison by none other than Joe's late husband. The case file had her husband's name on it, triggering painful memories. Joe contacted the district attorney's office to obtain more information about Aaron, only to find out that the robbery division was also interested in him. His fingerprints had been found at the scene of a jewelry heist. Joe and Henry went to question Aaron's wife, who defended her husband, insisting he had changed and would never rob a jewelry store. Henry wanted to investigate the robbery scene, but Joe thought it was unnecessary. In her mind, most criminals never really changed their ways. Despite her reservations, they went to the jewelry store. To Joe's surprise, she ran into Hugh, a robbery division detective she had attended police academy with. Hugh clearly had feelings for Joe, a fact that made things awkward. Observant as always, Henry picked up on the tension immediately. Henry wasted no time recreating the robbery. After mimicking the thief's actions, he concluded that Aaron wasn't the perpetrator. The real thief was left-handed, whereas Aaron's right hand was injured, making it nearly impossible for him to have smashed the glass cases. Additionally, the thief only destroyed the security cameras after stealing the jewelry, suggesting they had deliberately planted evidence to frame Aaron. Hugh, bewildered, watched as Henry's conclusions unraveled his entire investigation. Back at the station, Joe received Aaron's interrogation file from the district attorney, conducted by her late husband. Just as she was about to break down, Henry barged in, prompting her to make a hasty exit. Aware of Joe's distress, Henry tried his best to comfort her using his words only but not muscles, though his efforts were clumsy. The investigation had uncovered an unexpected lead. The thief's mask had a distinct smell of pancakes. When the sheriff tried to sniff it like a dog, Henry stopped him, explaining that the scent wasn't from food, but from the thief's sweat. The thief had diabetes, which affected his body odor. Henry suggested they look into Aaron's acquaintances for any who had diabetes. Henry studied the photos on the table and immediately identified the likely suspect, a friend of Aaron's who had diabetes. The friend became their prime suspect in the jewelry heist. With a robbery and murder involved, the robbery and homicide divisions joined forces. Henry wanted to tag along for the bust, but Detective Hugh blocked him from coming. Before leaving, Henry asked the sheriff to keep an eye on Joe, further cementing that his concern for her was genuine. When the police stormed the suspect's hideout, he panicked and fled. Joe and the sheriff searched the warehouse carefully, but suddenly gunfire rang out. The sheriff was hit and fell to the ground. Fortunately, it was just a shot to the arm. After a few more shots, Hugh appeared and told Joe that he had shot and killed the suspect. Henry performed an autopsy on the suspect and found that Hugh's bullet had struck his heart. However, something was off. In the suspect's stomach, Henry discovered several diamond cases, but when he had them examined by Abe, they were revealed to be of low quality. It didn't make sense. Why would someone carefully plan a heist for cheap diamonds? In the hospital, Joe and the sheriff concluded that both suspects were dead and the case could be closed. But Henry wasn't convinced. There were too many unanswered questions. The sheriff, noticing Joe's emotional struggle with the case, privately asked Henry to drop it. The investigation was reminding her too much of her late husband, and the sheriff wanted to spare her more pain. Henry outwardly agreed, but secretly continued digging with Lucas's help. They found red paint on Aaron's body, which wasn't from the crime scene, raising further questions. Tracing Aaron's steps, Henry eventually found a red-painted door. Upon closer inspection, it was clear that Aaron had been here. The red paint on his hands came from pounding on this door. Henry knocked, and to his surprise, the door opened to reveal Jo's house. She was just as shocked to see them. Henry explained that Aaron had been at her house the night he died, and Jo remembered hearing someone knock on her door that night. Henry quickly realized Aaron wasn't there to see Jo, but her late husband. They summoned Aaron's wife again, who admitted that she and her husband had known Jo's husband. Aaron had been facing a 20-year sentence, but Jo's husband had pleaded for leniency, resulting in his sentence being reduced to just 3 years. Both Aaron and his wife were deeply grateful to the officer, but she had no idea why Aaron had tried to contact him the night he died. One evening, Henry and Jo were having drinks at a bar and chatting. Jo had a few too many, and the next morning, she woke up to find Abe in front of her, which made it clear she had ended up at Henry's place. Embarrassed by her blackout, she accepted a special hangover cure from Abe, who seemed quite invested in his potential future stepmother. Abe then mentioned that an antique of his had been stolen and asked for Jo's help in investigating. Jo asked if it was valuable, to which Abe replied that while it was a replica, it would have been valuable had it been insured, but unfortunately it wasn't. This triggered a realization for Henry. The thief who stole the worthless diamonds might have been the store owner trying to commit insurance fraud. Jo shared this idea with Hugh, and they prepared to arrest the culprit. Once again, Hugh refused to let Henry join the operation. Watching them leave, Henry had no choice but to return to the morgue. Just then, the sheriff returned from the hospital after being discharged. As they chatted about his gunshot wound, Henry insisted on examining the injury himself. With nothing better to do, they unwrapped the sheriff's freshly bandaged arm. Henry recreated the scene from the night the sheriff was shot, calculating the angle and position of both the sheriff and the shooter. The trajectory didn't add up for a shot to the arm. It shouldn't have hit there. Both men immediately thought of Detective Hugh. Henry grew worried since Jo was alone with Hugh now. Hugh had already lied to Jo, saying the suspect wasn't home and redirecting her to another location. Jo, trusting her longtime friend and police academy classmate, didn't think twice and turned the car around. But Hugh let something slip. He mentioned Jo's home address, which immediately raised her suspicions. Jo discreetly placed a Bluetooth earpiece in her ear and dialed the sheriff's number. Unfortunately, the sheriff had left his phone on his desk while rallying his team, so he didn't notice the call. Luckily, Henry picked it up instead. Though Jo didn't speak directly, she asked Hugh about their destination, giving Henry enough clues to understand her situation. Realizing he had been exposed, Hugh remained calm, even asking Jo how she figured it out. Jo explained that her husband, the district attorney, had their home address tightly protected. The fact that Hugh knew it meant he had followed Aaron to her house and was responsible for running him over. Sensing things were unraveling, Hugh grabbed Jo's gun from her holster. Jo didn't resist, hoping to bait him into confessing more. Hugh, unaware the phone was still connected, confidently revealed the whole truth. He had caught the jewelry store owner committing insurance fraud but didn't report him. Instead, they devised a bigger plan together. Hugh had Aaron's diabetic friend rob the jewelry store, with the owner agreeing to split the insurance payout. But things went wrong when Aaron saw what happened and recognized Hugh, forcing Hugh to kill him and frame him as the scapegoat. Hugh then ordered Jo to drive into an unmonitored area, while Henry and the sheriff, listening from the command center, scrambled to find a solution. Henry devised a risky plan and instructed Jo to crash the car into a roadblock at high speed, assuring her that it would ensure her safety as the driver. The passenger, however, might not fare so well. He urged Jo to trust him. As they neared the roadblock, Jo, putting her faith in Henry, floored the gas pedal and rammed into the barrier. In the command center, everyone held their breath. Henry's theory sounded plausible, but had never been tested. Even Henry himself was anxious about the outcome. Rushing to the scene, Henry found Jo safe and unharmed. He finally exhaled in relief, and in a tender moment, his hand grasped hers, a sign that their bond had grown closer through this life-and-death ordeal. Later that night, Jo sat at home, watching old videos of her late husband, as loneliness and longing filled her heart. Just then, there was a knock at the door. To her surprise, it was Henry. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.